Good evening, friends, and thank you for being here at the Sacramento Public Library this evening. My name is Peter Coyle. I'm the Library Director and CEO of the library, and we welcome you to the Central Library for this program tonight. We'd like to thank our partner seated at the table for selling books. They have books for sale out in the lobby. And we'd also like to thank the generosity of Mr. Kyriakis Sakopoulos for donating the complimentary copies of books that people received today. We appreciate his generosity. I'd also like to thank the staff here at the Central Library, specifically our community engagement and outreach services team for putting this program together, and our facilities team who sets up the space. These events take months of planning, and we're so grateful that you guys are all here in a capacity crowd to hear this fantastic program tonight. We'd also like to thank the Friends of the Sacramento Public Library for their generous financial support of our programs at events like this. If you're interested in supporting them and joining, there is a table in the lobby that you can speak to. The illustrious Friends President Rachel Caldor is out there, and she'll be happy to answer all your questions about the Friends. Thien Ho was elected District Attorney of Sacramento County in 2022 and officially took office in January 2023. And rumor has it he was sworn in this space. So we're really happy to have him back here again tonight. He's the former vice president of the National Asian Pacific Islander Prosecutors Association, Northern California chapter. In 2017, he was presented with their Sacramento District Attorney Office Prosecutor of the Year Award. Over his 23-year career as an attorney, he successfully prosecuted sexual assault, gang, and homicide cases. He was the supervisor of the Gang and Hate Crime Unit and has personally charged and prosecuted hate crimes. District Attorney Ho was the lead prosecutor of one of the most notorious serial predators in American history, the Golden State Killer. His book, The People versus the Golden State Killer, is the first official account of how the Golden State Killer was apprehended and put behind bars for life. Ho led an elite team of law enforcement from 6 California prosecutors' offices in the hunt for D'Angelo. But it also recounts Ho's fascinating personal journey, escaping communist Vietnam on a fishing boat as a child, working his way up from an internship to an elite homicide division, and eventually to Sacramento's district attorney. He'll be joined this evening with a number of guests, including our mayor and our sheriff who is here, and so we're grateful for all the elected officials who will be joining us tonight. So please welcome me in joining our evening's speaker, District Attorney Ho.
First of all, thank you so much for being here today. Before we start, and I do want to recognize some dignitaries here at this location, but before we do, for those of you who have your book in hand right now, can I ask you a favor to hold it up so I can take a picture of you with it? All right, let's hold it up high and bright. All right, there we go. Keep them up. All right, I'm going to take a couple pictures here and maybe even a selfie. All right. Thank you so much. So I hope I didn't miss anybody. I felt like my 15-year-old son and my 20-year-old daughter just doing that just now. But I hope I don't miss any of the dignitaries and people here today, but I do want to recognize a few people. I want to recognize what I believe is the best sheriff in the country, Sheriff Jim Cooper. Recognize Sacramento City Mayor Kevin McCarty. I believe I've also seen in the room as well our Assembly Member Stephanie Nguyen. And I believe that there is also, I heard Supervisor Patrick Kennedy, my good friend. If he's here, Supervisor Kennedy, thank you so much. There's also our former school board member, Dara Wu, as well. And I know Phil Pluckybaum from the City Council was here as well. So Phil, are you here? Thank you, Phil. And if I miss any other elected officials, please raise your hand. I do also want to recognize we are here in the Sakopoulos Galleria, and Kyriakos Sakopoulos, are you here? So Kyriakos Sakopoulos is the son of Angelos Sakopoulos, and his family is named for this. He's one of the sponsors of the book. I also want to thank the library as well, the Sacramento Library, for the amazing job that you've done to put this event together. In particular, I do want to recognize Phyllis's Garden. And I will talk about Phyllis's Garden more in a moment, but it is a nonprofit that supports survivors supporting survivors. And it was really the inspiration for this book and writing it. And I would ask that every member who is part of Phyllis's Garden, please stand up. Thank you. I do want to recognize Judge Michael Bowman was here earlier as well. He was the presiding judge at the end of the case. There are law enforcement and members from my office that are here, from Lieutenant Kirk Campbell from my office's Cold Case Science and Technology Unit, Michelle Hendricks, who's also an investigator with my office, along with Kevin Papanow. We have Michelle Hendricks as well is here. We have Monica Jakowski, who you'll hear in a little bit, was the person that found D'Angelo. We have two great advocates, May Lynn and Ann, that are here as well, so thank you so much. I do want to recognize Chris Pedretti, who's a survivor, along with Gay, Linda, Sandy, Trish, our former Undersheriff Carol Daly as well, so thank you. And also want to recognize my wife Jenny, who's here as well, who I could not do this without her. And then before I do turn it over to my friend Sheriff Cooper, I do want to recognize Third State Book. So Third State Book is a independent publishing company that primarily focuses on getting the voices of API authors out. The two co-founders are here, Charles Kim and Stephanie Lim as well. Thank you so much. And I'm going to bring up Sheriff Jim Cooper, and why I want to do so is this, we were such partners with the Sacramento Sheriff's Department and the police department as well. But the Sheriff's Department dedicated a tremendous number of resources and officers and detectives, whether they be Sergeant Detective Kenny Clark and Rob Peters, who worked hand in hand with the supervisor of the homicide team, Rod Norgard, who I believe is here. But it was the Sheriff's Department who did an amazing job in terms of working with us on the case and bringing this to fruition and justice. And the leader of that department, who I think is the best sheriff in the country, is Sheriff Jim Cooper. And I'm going to ask that he come up here and say a few words, because he is a true advocate and a champion of public safety. So, Sheriff Cooper.
Good evening. Good to see you all here. This is an amazing turnout in support of Thien. And I'll tell you what, we have an amazing DA, and it really started a long time ago. You think about the Golden State Killer. I grew up in Rancho Cordova, was born and raised there as a 12 or 13-year-old, and this was going on. So I got to experience it and see it firsthand and feel it. And just involved in that, went into it under Sheriff Carol Daly, was one of the lead investigators in that case when it first started. So Carol, thank you very much. Appreciate your leadership. And really so much has happened. In that case, it's tough with cases. Thien was the right person at the right time, very aggressive, very fair, but a firm DA. And I'll tell you what, having been in the legislature, you deal with a lot of DAs statewide, and Thien by far is one of the best DAs that we have here in California. He's concerned about victims. When you with him behind the scenes, talking about cases and issues, his first thing is, what are we doing for the victims? He cares about victims. And this book really highlights the investigation and what happened here in Sacramento, where we caught the Golden State Killer. And because of Thien and Thien's hard work, the case got solved and resolved. And we put Mr. D'Angelo away where he belongs. So I work with you every day. We talk about a lot of cases. A thoughtful man, very thoughtful. You know, I keep going back. The first words are victims. That's what he cares about. And a lot of folks these days care about the perpetrators, but he truly cares about the victim. We are very fortunate in Sacramento to have a DA such as Thien. I hope you stay here. Don't leave us. I love working with you. But thank you for coming out. That says a lot about this person right here, this show of support for what he's done for our community and what he's going to continue to do. So thank you all for coming out, and God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want, before we begin the interview, I do want to recognize Kyriakos Akopoulos, who's now in the house. His generosity, by the way, and his sponsorship has allowed us to give out 100 books for free tonight. And his family have been such great advocates and champion of the community, the Sakopoulos family. And Kyriakos, thank you so much for your support. So with that, I'd like to invite up for the conversation our members from the Sacramento Library to discuss the first part of the conversation we're going to have before we have a wonderful addition to that conversation. So please come on up.
I was sharing with Thien before, I think this is our largest crowd for an author, and definitely for a first-time author. So.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'm very excited. So I had the pleasure of reading the book actually over the weekend. And whenever I read a book, I always try to pick one word to describe the book. And the word that kept coming up for me was the word resilience. Your resilience in following the case through, the resilience of the victims, and then the resilience of all of the people who dedicated their careers to finding justice. And I just wanted to check in with you if you have a word to describe the book.
You know, Todd, I think you stole the word from me, which is resiliency, right? When I think about the book, I think of resiliency. You're talking about 4 generations of law enforcement that never gave up the pursuit to find him. And then you talk about the victims and the survivors who really never gave up hope. And even when they felt like they gave up hope, when they came to court, they stood up and made sure that their voices were heard. And just the resiliency of the human spirit. When I think of people like Chris, when I think of people like Linda and Trish, when I think of people like, you know, all the other ones in Gay, it's the resiliency of the human spirit. And so in all that darkness, let's not forget the resiliency.
So in the opening pages of the book, you really set the stage for the rest of the story. I had never heard Rancho Cordova described as the Cho. When sharing this story, what was your biggest challenge in describing these rapidly changing communities?
You know, it was interesting in terms of writing the book, and I know I talked a lot about it with my editor, Charles. You're talking about 13 known murders, upwards of 50 sexual assaults, 120 burglaries in 11 different jurisdictions up and down the state of California that happened from 1974 to 1986. And then it goes dark for over 30 years until we found him again. And how do you encapsulate that story, right? In terms of introducing the Cho or the Riviera down in Southern California and telling that story. And so the way I looked at it, I'm gonna raise a hand. How many of you seen the movie The Titanic? Raise your hand, please. All right, everybody's seen it. So in The Titanic, if you notice, there's the A and the B and the C story, right? The A story in The Titanic is the search for the Hope Diamond. The B story is the love story between Leo and Kate. And the C story is the sinking of the Titanic. And so in the same way here, the A story was the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution of this monster. The B story was sort of my story and journey. But the C story, which is really the heart and soul of the entire case, were the stories of the survivors, right? And the victims who never got to celebrate another holiday, saw another sunset or sunrise, but it was the survivors and the victims. And so that's how I try to weave it in there in terms of introducing to the different areas and jumping back and forth in time.
That actually kind of leads into my next question. What struck me most when reading the book was the structure of the story. each chapter includes a past, near past, and present section. And a lot of true crime books don't read that way. And I just was wondering, how did you decide on that format to tell the story that way?
Having never written a book in my life, it was just the way I approached how I try a case and how I wrote it, So I've talked about the writing process before, which is sort of, I don't know any better. So I wrote a 30-page outline in terms of the book, and then every morning I'd wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and write for 2 hours. I'd send the materials over to my editor, Charles, who fixed the grammar, the structure, sent it back to me, and we kept writing it. And along the way, my wife would remind me, you have a deadline coming up. And she'd like, come on, get to work, right? In her own gentle, sweet way on that, because I needed that push because, my day job does take up a little bit of time. So, but it was just that process of writing it, and it just came naturally, telling the story of past and present and coming together. It's just, as trial lawyers, and we have some great trial lawyers in this room, whether it's Mr. Gavriloff or Ms. Ann Fong, it's the process of telling the story. That's what we do, for a living.
You described the sheer magnitude of information required for the prosecution and how you created a repository for cataloging and accessing it. How did you go about organizing everything, and what was the biggest way this process supported your prosecution?
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
Sorry, what was the biggest way this process supported your prosecution?
So the way we did it, we had 3 million pages of what we call discovery. Those are 30 million pages of police reports, right? That does include all the forensic tests, the 10,000 suspects. It doesn't include, for example, all the interviews, the photographs. I mean, and after a while, I remember we were flying down to LA for the first prosecutor meeting, and we're about to land in LA, and LA is what, has like 10 million people. And I just remember as we were about to land in the City of Angels, and remember that city has seen the Menendez brothers, seen the Grim Sleeper, seen the Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, all these cases. But I remember as I was landing there, and I'd been assigned the case, and I was with other prosecutors, as we were landing there, I suddenly got a panic attack. My chest was tightening up. I was having a hard time breathing. I was just thinking, my God, the scope of this case, how are we going to handle this, right? And so I had to take a deep breath, and I reminded myself of this saying, which was, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. So what we did was, every county would put their police reports together and organize it. Orange County would do it, Santa Barbara would do it, Ventura, Contra Costa, and we gave them like a bait stamp, a number that says, SB for Santa Barbara, and they label it from 1 to like 100,000. And they were responsible for sending it to my office, and I was the discovery coordinator where it would come. I would read through it. So I read through everything, saw through everything, and then we would send it off to the defense. And I believe we have Diane Howard, who was the first public defender in the House here as well. So I think Diane is here, so I wanted to recognize her. But it was that process of getting all of it together, organizing it, and I was doing it digitally as well. We had a great team of investigators who did follow-up investigation, whether it was Michelle Hendricks and Kevin Papanow and the rest of the Sheriff's Department. It was meticulous the way it was done.
So you go into great detail in the book about how you tried to learn everything you could about Joseph DeAngelo, particularly his past. And as a reader, I thought I was aware of the case, and I really had such a small idea of the story. And I just wanted to ask, was there any detail you learned about his past that surprised you the most?
I would say no, and it was interesting in this sense, and I'll answer it like this, and this is where I will go into some detail about the criminal, just to put it in perspective, because it was something, and I'm going to bring it back to something that Gay said in her impact statement, and I put it in the book. There's a chapter called The Monster Behind the Mask. So one of the things that we did from the moment we identified him, and what I call the body snatchers over at the Sheriff's Department went and took him in custody, we retraced every step of his life, from the moment he was born in Bath, New York, to the moment he was arrested and thereafter. And what we did find out was when he was a child, he had witnessed his younger sister, Connie, being sexually assaulted by military members overseas, and he was held down. And then he grew up, he was abused by his parents, but then he grew up and he abused animals, right? And you think about this, how are monsters created? And it's a question that we talk about. Is it nature, is it nurture? But at the end of the day, and Gay put it so beautifully in her impact statement, she says, you know, I had my life, you know, assaulted to the point of near death. And I didn't turn into a monster and do these things. It was a choice that you made. And it's always about choices. The choice of either accepting light or darkness, the choice of accepting, you know, goodness or evil. It was a choice. And so really, the FBI did a profile of him, ex-military law enforcement, and everything just checked. All the boxes checked. And everything. So nothing really surprised me. But I was constantly reminded by the choices that we make in life. And he made his choice. And now he's serving out those choices and the consequences.
So we know that D'Angelo never spoke about, confessed, or revealed any insights into his mindset. How did that silence shape your strategy?
In terms of his silence, talking about the interrogation. So what you'll read very early on in the book and that has never been revealed publicly is the interrogation. So, you know, part of the detectives at the sheriff's department were brilliant. What they did was when they arrested him, you know, and they took him into custody, he's in the cargo shorts and the tube socks and the t-shirt, looking like some drunk uncle from Thanksgiving, right? And so he's they put him in the interrogation room, and the first technique is that they let him sit there. They let him sit there for almost 2 hours. Just let him stew in his own juices, thinking, what do they know? Why am I here? What evidence do they have? You know, what am I being arrested for? All these things, right? We let them sit there. They let him sit there. And Detective Kenny Clark let him just sit there so you could think about it. Then they come in and they kept offering him Diet Dr. Pepper, right? They offered him Dr. Pepper because at the crime scene, there were Dr. Pepper that was consumed. And when we did a search warrant into his house, what did the sheriff's department find? Cases of Dr. Pepper. And so they were offering him Dr. Pepper during the interview. And he would sit there, just licking his lips, right? Not saying anything. Just completely silent. And I remember watching the video. At one point, I thought that the video actually froze because he was sitting there motionless for like half an hour. But he wouldn't take the Dr. Pepper or drink because he thought that we wanted to collect his DNA, but what he didn't know was we already had his DNA, right? But he's sitting there completely silent. They confronted him with the murders of Brian and Katie. They confronted him with the crimes, the sexual assault, the stuff that happened, and you know, the crimes that happened in Ventura. And he said nothing. He says, I don't remember. And I detail in the book, very detailed. But then when they left the room, he started talking to himself. And that's when he tried to lay the groundwork for a mental defense, which is a dissociative identity, a split personality, and blame this on Jerry, okay? But he was the master malingerer because he said, Jerry made me do it. I didn't want to do it, but Jerry made me do it. Well, here's a little thing about the McNaughton rule of insanity in California, right? And I talk about this. You can have a mental disease and defect when you commit crimes, but you are only legally insane if you don't understand the nature and consequences of what you did. He understood what he did because he said, Jerry made me do it. I didn't want to do it, which meant that he knew what he was doing was wrong. So he just undercut his whole mental defense, right? And he was a master manipulator because in 1979, when he was arrested for shoplifting, okay, dog repellent and a hammer, he fought with the loss prevention officer. And when he fought with them, they held him down and he pretended to say crazy random things. And when the sheriff's department showed up, he admitted to them, hey, I was just pretending to be crazy because I didn't want them calling the police. So he has a history of being a malingerer and a manipulator.
As a reader, I felt like I was in the interrogation scene. It was riveting. What did you make of Jerry, the alter ego D'Angelo mentioned in his interrogation? Do you think it reflected any truth, or is it just a manipulative tactic?
Zero truth, total manipulation. You know, we hired one of the top experts. Orange County in our office hired one of the top forensic psychologists in the country. And what we found out was dissociative identity disorder, right? And you see him, it was popular in the 70s with, I think that show Sybil, right? Is you usually have these blackout periods. You have absolute loss of memory and amnesia. You are unable to function in life. You have suicidal ideations. There are a number of check boxes, right? So we got all that. And then what we did was the detectives at the sheriff's department, they went out and interviewed his family, his friends, his co-workers, right? To say, well, did he ever describe having amnesia, right? Did he ever have blackouts? So you go through these checks. So basically we were taking away the defense before it really even had a chance to develop.
What lasting impacts do you think this case will have on criminal justice and forensic investigation practices in the future?
That's a great question, and it gives me a chance to really highlight the things that my office is doing right now, along with the Sheriff's Department. So after we use genetic genealogy, right? And genetic genealogy, for those who are not familiar with, how many of you ever used 23andMe, Ancestry, right? So basically you take a swab, right? You send it off. So what we did was, for years, we took his DNA from the crime scene and uploaded it into CODIS, which is the FBI database. But there was never a hit because when he was arrested, he'd never been arrested or charged after the discovery of forensic DNA. So there was never a hit. But Paul Holes, my friend and colleague from Contra Costa County, what he came up with the idea, and I talked about it, is the use of genetic genealogy, right? So what we do is we had to take some DNA from the crime scene. And fact of the matter is we went to Orange County, but Orange County had DNA but didn't want to give it up. So we went to our friends in Ventura who had DNA from the Charlene Smith rape case, and we had pristine DNA there. So the idea was to take that DNA, convert it into what we call a SNP profile, single nucleotide polymorphism, right? SNP. It measures 1 million different areas on your chromosome. And so that data is uploaded to one of these genealogy databases. And it's compared to all the other SNP profiles in their database. The more places you have in common with somebody, the more closely related you are. So when we did that, we found out that he had a distant cousin, right? But now we had to build a family tree, all right? That distant cousin, who are their brothers and sisters? Who are their parents, their uncles and aunties, their grandparents, their great-grandparents? So you build it all the way up to the common ancestor and back down to the suspect, but you have like 1,000+ names on this family tree. And it was the job of our team, and it's Kirk Campbell, our lieutenant, along with Monica Jakowski, who was in our office along with Paul Holes. They worked to build that family tree. And then you had to go through that list of suspects. How many were male? How many had blue eyes? How many were police officers in the military? How many lived in Sacramento, in Orange County, and all these places? And it came down to just a handful of names. And in fact, I remember, and I saw the email myself. It was sent by Monica, who doesn't get enough credit, who hates credit, but I'm gonna credit her tonight. She sent an email out and says, I think this guy might be it. And it was Monica who identified him. And then the Sheriff's Department worked to follow him around. And there's a scene I described there. He's riding his motorcycle, right? And weaving in and out of traffic. And we ended up getting a garbage truck, lining up with plastic, right? We put Sergeant Detective Darrell Meadows, who I've worked with back in the day in Narcs. He dressed up as a garbage truck guy, drove up to D'Angelo's house when he put out his garbage, collected it, dumped it in there. And the last item that our amazing crime lab tested was a piece of tissue. And that piece of tissue came back to the DNA hit to the Southern California rapes and murders and the ones up in Contra Costa. And we have, using that technique around the world, solved nearly 1,000 cold cases. So that is the future of forensic genealogy.
You mentioned Paul Holes made a visit to the library, and you can tease him and tell him you got a bigger crowd than he did.
Yeah, Paul Holes looked like he's out of central casting for a criminalist on TV.
As a reader, one thing that I really enjoyed about the book was you filled different details about your life and also different pop culture references throughout. You talked about being a big fan of the TV show The Streets of San Francisco. Star Wars is thrown in there. And one story I found really relatable and interesting was you talked about the challenges of watching Law and Order with your wife, Jenny, and how that can be challenging. And this is your opportunity to really set the record straight. What is the difference between real life and watching Law and Order on TV?
Yes. So my wife loves true crime. She loves Law and Order. What are the other shows you watch on? Or there's a bunch of them, right? And she'd make me sit there with her and watch it. And invariably, I get very frustrated. That's not how they do it. That's not what happens. And I start like just yelling things out and like throwing my hands up in the air to the point where she'll throw a pillow at me and I get kicked out of the room. And I think I got kicked out the other night as well. She was watching some TV show. And so, you know, I think for lawyers, and there's a number of prosecutors here from my office, I mean, it's frustrating when you don't see that they always dramatize stuff that doesn't need to be dramatized, and they get stuff. I'm getting frustrated again. So, but it is not a reflection on real life. Sorry.
How did you interpret his decision to plead guilty and accept a life sentence? Did you see it as strategy, guilt, or self-preservation?
You know, I do want to give credit to my colleagues on the other side of the courtroom. I know Diane is here. She's long since been retired from the public defender's office, but I think I called her in the book the D'Angelo Whisperer. You know, and I've worked with Diane many years, and so I give my colleagues on the other side of the courtroom credit for how they handled the case. But I think ultimately the way we set up the case, whether it was the interrogation, whether it was other aspects of the case, he had very little room to maneuver. But most of all, I need to give credit to the survivors and the victims and their families. And I talk about it in the book. There was a meeting, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail, but where the survivors, whether it was Gay or whether it was Chris or Phyllis or Jen Carroll, who was the daughter of Lyman and Charlene Smith, who were murdered in Ventura, stood up and said, you know what, we want to make sure that all the victims, both those that were cases were charged and uncharged, had a seat in that courtroom and had a voice. Because the fact of the matter is this, and I talk about it in there, back in the 1970s, the statute of limitation for rape was 3 years. That meant that from the time the rape happened to when we could charge it was 3 years. It was 3 years in a day, I couldn't charge it as the prosecutor. So when those cases expired, we lost all the evidence and we weren't able to charge Chris's case, Phyllis's case, you know, a number of these cases. But we were able to charge a few of them through a very novel idea of a kidnapping allegation. And I know Tricia's case was one of those. But all the victims where the cases were uncharged and charged spoke up and said, you know what, we need this. We need to make sure, you know, and Linda talked about as well, need to have the victims heard. And so when the opportunity presented itself to resolve the case and allow that to happen, it did. And all the credit goes to the survivors.
One of the most powerful parts of the book is you actually include the victims' statements in the text, and reading them was remarkable. And you did such a great job of just humanizing the victims, sharing their personalities and lives beyond their trauma. And how intentional was it for you to really humanize the victims?
This is the inspiration, really, for the book. Because people ask me, why'd you write this book, especially 5 years later? Phyllis was the very first sexual assault victim in Sacramento. And I remember, you know, she was 23 at the time, and I remember reading her case, reading her description of what happened and description of her. And here I am, the first time I'm in court after I was assigned the case. And this woman walks up to me. She's in her early 60s, pepper gray hair, thick Coke bottle glasses, barely 5 feet tall. She reaches out, touches my hand, and says, "Hi, my name is Phyllis. I'm victim number 1. And then, "Hi, my name is Chris. I'm victim number 10, right? And just the numbers kept growing and growing. And Phyllis would always be there near the front row. And I would sit down early on when the court case was there and talk to Phyllis, let her know what was happening. as the case was, later in the case, as we were coming to a resolution, Phyllis was diagnosed with cancer, and she couldn't be in court. And I'll always remember this, that when we had the plea in court, we have the allocution, and Law and Order gets this right. The allocution is when you have that, you read the statement of that case. And I remember we were reading the allocution of Phyllis's case. She couldn't be there because she was fighting cancer. All the survivors and victims stood up to represent her. And I literally had chills and goosebumps on my arm. About 2 months later, it was time to give the impact statement, and I was looking forward to seeing Phyllis again. But on that day, she couldn't make it. She wasn't feeling well, and her sister read Phyllis's statement. The next day, we're back in the courtroom, or 2 days later, we're back in the makeshift courtroom at Sac State, and I look across the ballroom. My job is essentially over, but I see Chris sit there with Phyllis, and I see her with the mask on. We're in the middle of COVID, and she's got this twinkle in her eye. For the first time in 40 years, Phyllis finally obtained a measure of justice. 3 months later, May Lynn called me and told me that Phyllis had passed away from cancer. And I know that Chris and Gay and Carol Daly were there on her deathbed. If we didn't have that resolution in the case, Phyllis would have never had her day of justice like so many of the other survivors and victims. And so this is for Phyllis and all the survivors who never got to celebrate another anniversary, another birthday, another sunrise. And that's why I know Chris and Gay started Phyllis's Garden, and we'll talk about more of that, but a portion of the proceeds is going to fund and support Phyllis's Garden. And I cannot advocate enough. There's signs out here for Phyllis's Garden. Please go to the QR code. Please support Phyllis's Garden and the work that they do, survivors supporting survivors.
Your approach to centering the victims and survivors supporting survivors, it is reflected in the book. It's also actually reflected in the cover of the book. A lot of true crime books actually focus on the criminal. And there were some decisions made on the beautiful cover, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure. For me, a case that was very personal was the murder of Brian and Katie Majori. Our sheriff talked about how he grew up in Rancho Cordova. He had a friend who lived right behind where the murder of Brian and Katie happened. And Brian and Katie were 21 and 19 years old. They were just married. Brian was a staff sergeant over at the Air Force Base, and they were out walking their dog that night, in February with a quarter moon, and they never made it home. They were murdered because they came upon the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist. And so they were killed right behind this home that's on the cover. And so I wanted to almost give them respect that was their final resting place that they had. And I didn't want his picture. I didn't want his face on it. I wanted a place where Brian and Katie were last together. And I took the picture, in fact, I think my wife and I that night, we were talking about it. We drove out to Rancho Cordova, took the picture of that, and, I sent it to our editor, and they put that together on there. And so they were the inspiration.
What did you personally learn and take away from the survivors and families of victims as they showed such resilience?
One word: resiliency. Resiliency.
Okay. Since his sentencing, have you seen changes in how your community discusses trauma, justice, or closure?
Absolutely. And I think Phyllis's Garden and the work they do really imbues law enforcement in the work that we do to make it more victim-centered. And I know that at the forefront of that are the work that they do at the Sheriff's Department with Sheriff Cooper and all the other law enforcement partners that we have, and in my office as well.
So Chris Pedretti is the 10th known survivor of the Golden State Killer, attacked when she was only 15 years old. Today, Chris is a powerful advocate for survivors of sexual violence. She facilitates survivor-led support groups, hosts healing gatherings, and speaks publicly through podcasts, media appearances, and community events to help others break their silence and release the shame that was never theirs to carry. In addition to her advocacy work, Chris partners with law enforcement agencies to create trauma-informed, soft interview rooms, providing safe and supportive spaces for victims to give statements. She's the founder of Phyllis's Garden, a nonprofit dedicated to building trauma-informed healing spaces and supporting survivor-led programming. Her mission is grounded in a vital truth: the blame and shame of rape belong to the rapist, never the survivor. Please welcome me in joining Chris Pedretti.
I just have something to say before we start. Don't mess with Olivia Benson. I'm with you, Jenny.
Did you want me to start? So, Chris, the book mentions that you once slept with your doors and windows unlocked as sort of a challenge. How did this help you reclaim control?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure how that works, but after after I was raped, I refused to lock any doors, windows, not my car. And through therapy, many decades later, I learned that is a sense of control, and that many victims do things that seem very odd to others, but our control has been completely taken from us. And maybe this is a way of saying it's not going to happen. If I just leave it wide open, maybe nobody would ever come in. And I know it sounds silly, but so many different behaviors of untreated trauma can come across as bewildering to other people.
Can I ask a question in regards to something that you brought up? Chris, can you tell us a little bit? You know, you went for years trying to find your way and not getting therapy. What was the turning point for you really in terms of your journey towards healing? Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, for 42 years, I lived in a pretend world. I lived in a world that said this didn't happen. My father had ordered my family to never speak about it to anybody, so we didn't. And it really created just a whirlwind of identity challenges. I didn't have an identity anymore. And I became comfortable with this pretend life. And then one day in April 24th, I believe, 2018, I was in a hotel room by myself on a work event, and I got a call early in the morning from my daughter. And she wrote 6 words. It was a text, I'm sorry. And she said, "I think he has been caught." And I was like, what is she talking about? And so I went laid back down because it was really early. And then it hit me. Oh God, I know exactly what she's talking about. I jumped up, I called, I said, "Are you talking about him? Did he get caught?" And she said, "Yeah, Mom, I think so. And you're gonna love this one." I said, "How do you know this?" And she said, "We read it on Reddit." Who'd know, right? But anyways, right after that, my husband called and he said, "Babe, I think he's been caught." And then moments after that, Carol Daly called and she said, "Hi, Chris, this is Carol Daly. And I need to tell you that the East Area rapist has been caught." And then she said, "We have 100% DNA match. It's him." And at that point, all that pretending, everything that I had built to protect myself from having to deal with this horrible attack broke through. I began shaking. I went into shock. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I barely got home. My husband, Steve, said, "Can I come get you?" My daughter, they were worried. And that moment, that day, told me, I have to get help because I can't pretend anymore. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
One part of the book that really stuck out to me was how your family didn't move after your attack and how you went back to your parents' home consistently. And if you can talk a little bit more just about kind of family dynamics for victims and what people can do to support people in their lives who are victims of crime.
Yeah, actually, we did move.
Oh, you did?
But we didn't move for 6 months.
Okay.
And those 6 months, I know that there are other victims of D'Angelo's that stayed in the same house. And it was really hard even for those 6 months. I couldn't take a shower without somebody standing outside the door. Every noise I heard, friends didn't want to be my friends anymore because in '76, this was a topic you didn't talk about, and it must have been something I did that created it. But that year I did change schools 3 times. We moved, lost all my friends, and all this while I'm trying to pretend nothing ever happened. So although we did not stay in the house for very long, I do understand what it's like, and I know it was very hard for those victims that parents chose to not move and they needed to stay and grow up in the same neighborhoods. I'm glad I was not one of them. I was lucky.
Chris, can I ask you, kind of go back to the moment where you found out and then the first time you went to court? Can you describe and sort of give our audience here some insight on what that was like the first time you went to court and what you were feeling when you went to court?
Wow, that was a big thing. I had never been in a courtroom. And so I'm going to back up just a little bit. So he gets arrested. I have to fly back home. I'm completely falling apart. And now there's going to be arraignment 2 days later. And so all this emotion is flooding everywhere. And we got a call, and it was from then DA Anne-Marie Schubert, and she was calling us all in for a meeting for the families, the victims, their loved ones. And it really hit hard, like, wow, I never thought I would meet another victim. I mean, I thought everyone had the code of silence. I thought nobody was allowed. And now I'm going to walk into a room and see these women who were assaulted by the same person I was assaulted by. They knew exactly what I had gone through. And it was very scary. And we walked in that room, and I saw these women, these beautiful women and their families. And we were all checking each other out. Like, are you a victim? Are you a victim? Because I don't think any of us ever thought we would meet another victim. And Paul Holes was there. There were key detectives there. So when that meeting was over, I remember walking out, and one of the victim advocates behind me tapped me on the shoulder. And I looked, and she said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, don't I look okay?" She said, "No, you don't." And so we were directed to these vans that were going to take us to the arraignment so the media wouldn't see us. It was chaotic. It was crazy. Like, there were people waiting to get in. I have never been a part of that kind of a media storm before. And so as I was starting to get in the van, I, like you, had a panic attack. And I told my husband, I was like, "I can't get on this van." And he said, "You can." And I said, "I can't." And he said, "You can," as he pushed me ahead. Thank you, Steve. Sometimes that's the best way to deal with somebody that is having a panic attack. Anyway, so we went down, and then we came into the back the back room to where the arraignment was going to be, and we were the only ones in the room. And so there were quite a few other victims, but we didn't speak to each other. My heart's thumping, I'm focusing on breathing. You know, this is a big deal. We've just seen each other, and now we're going to see the man who was behind the mask. We had no idea what he would look like. We didn't know what he would sound like, because while he was attacking us, he growled, he hissed. There was no real voice. And then they opened the doors, and all that chaos outside came rushing in, and the cameras were clicking, and it was overwhelming, scary. It was just, wow. And then they brought him in, and we were all looking at this cage, which I thought was insane. I'd never seen one of these cages in a room, little jail cage. You probably all know what I'm talking about, but I had never seen one of those. It reminded me of a cartoon where they've got their cup and they're just going, you know, like, and so our eyes are all trained on there. And, but he came in a wheelchair, and he came in through the back door, same door we did. And we had been warned that he was faking it, and boy, was he faking it. He was limp. He could hardly talk. They had to keep repeating the question. And it was almost laughable at that point. But I think that was the bravest day. Confronting him for the first time, meeting other victims. This is 2 days after he's been caught. And I will say our victim advocates, Maylin and Anne, were there for us. They watched over us. They made sure that we got in the room safely every single time. And then our prosecutors took good care of us. And I remember the defense attorneys, us always trying to jockey around them so we could see this man. So they did a really good job protecting his face. And we would all try to figure out where's the best place to sit so we can see, you know, his expressions, which he never had any. So, but as far as that first day, thank you for asking, I would say that was probably one of the most intense, profound days of beginning this journey to justice.
I've never heard anybody describe a prosecutor as like they took care of us. And could you just elaborate a little bit more on that experience of like the care the prosecutor's office showed the victims?
Yeah, I mean, from the very beginning, with our victim advocates, with DA Thien, with Amy Holliday, like our concerns were always important. And I make a joke all the time, but Maylene knows it's true. I called you a lot. I had a lot of questions because this is new. I'm out of control. I need to get in control. And the way I was finding a way to get into control was by questions and getting answers. And we got them every single time. Is this a good time I can talk about the meeting?
Yes, I think this is a great time. So I want to ask you about this, Chris. So I want to set the scene first, okay? So right now, to let you know, in a death penalty case, and if anybody deserved the death penalty, it was him. But as a death penalty case, we had to get our witnesses in the courtroom to testify. That's the challenge, right? We had a detective in Orange County that was 96, half deaf and half blind. We had a witness in Sacramento, Mr. Altlinger, who is 92 years old, and we needed his testimony on the murder of Brian and Katie Majoy because he could talk about the shoelace that was found next to the body. So we needed to get into courtroom, and in court I had argued, and the Judge White, set the hearing for a preliminary hearing. But then the defense wanted a continuance because in the midst of this, we were dealing with a pandemic that the world hadn't seen for 100 years. So in the midst of that, we all of a sudden got a text message from Maylin and Ann that the victims wanted to meet, the survivors. And so we ended up meeting in this big room over at the DA's office with everybody and the entire prosecution team. And so I'm going to turn it over to you now in terms of, you know, what was it that sparked the meeting and what happened at the meeting in terms of what did you want to happen from the meeting? So what sparked it and what did you want to happen?
What sparked it is kind of fun. So Gay, co-founder of Phyllis's Garden, myself, Jen Carroll, that you've already talked about, her parents were murdered. We kind of did a happy hour every Thursday. And we got, you know, we processed a lot. And we laughed and we had fun, but we really talked about what was happening. because there for a while, there was some miscommunication, like not all of the DAs, Sacramento was fantastic, by the way, but other counties weren't giving the same information. And we had 11 different counties, is that right? So a lot of jurisdictions, and so the victims had come together and we created a Facebook group so that whatever I knew, everyone knew. What Carol knew, everyone knew. What Gay knew, everyone knew. Because we were like, we can be our own force. And people were actually mad at Sacramento because Sacramento did such an excellent job of providing the information and the others weren't. In fact, Sacramento actually adopted Gay. She was from San Joaquin County, and they were like, come on over, we'll take care of you. Anyway, so during our happy hour talks, we had known that a plea may be happening, and we had that big talk, and we decided we need to be a part of this. And the next week, Bob, her husband, and Gay, and Carol, or Jen, my husband and me, we all met around our kitchen table, and we outlined everything. We're gonna have a meeting. And I was the spokesperson, so I called Maylin. And Maylin's now, hi, Chris. And we said, we want to have a meeting to discuss what we want. Maylin called us back and she said, you know what? It doesn't have to just be with you. Bring everybody. Tell everyone, tell their families. They can come. We want to hear everything they have to say. And after the next hearing, that's what happened. And it was, again, very freeing. I remember raising my hand saying, you know, I was an uncharged case, but we weren't raped any less than the others, you know, and we want to be a part of this. We want the justice that other people are getting. And Thien, I think the DA out of Ventura, like very supportive, and then they said this, they said, you know, that's a great idea. However, that's why we wanted you to come, because we were going to tell you that. And so we were on the same page. We didn't know it, but they were always looking out for us, always representing. And I think that's probably the best example, how they're always protecting us. The other things they did, hope I'm not jumping ahead too fast, but they made sure that all of us could give an impact statement. They made sure that we could talk for as long as we want and we can say whatever we want. And I'll tell you, there were some crazy things being said that day because the floor was ours. They gave us 5 days, or 4 days, I believe, because they weren't going to control what we had to say. I remember Judge Bowman saying, you have waited a long time for this day. And we want to make sure that you can say whatever you want. So it wasn't just the prosecutors, it wasn't just our victim advocates, it was our judge, it was everybody. And I think that's pretty incredible. And they definitely supported and empowered the survivors to be a part of this process.
Can I jump forward? Because there's two things I do want to cover. One is I want to jump forward to when the sentencing, the plea, all that stuff that happened in the ballroom. Because remember now, we're in March of 2020, and what happened in March of 2020, right? COVID hit. And you hear for the first time the word social distancing. What did that mean, right? And so now we needed a courtroom that could fit 200 people 6 feet apart. And so we were able to get into the Sacramento State Ballroom and make that into a makeshift courtroom. And so what were kind of your thoughts going into, you know, your feelings and those of the survivors as you were coming towards the end there in terms of the plea and the sentencing? Can you kind of share with us kind of your feelings?
Yeah, I think that we were excited. We were ready for the end. We knew what the plea was. It was very strange, sitting 6 feet apart from everybody. We were in little, like, pods, kind of, you know, like 6 here and 6 there. And, but the way, I'll call it the stage, it was a ballroom, was set up is that we could see D'Angelo's face, you know, and he didn't have a mask on anymore, even though there was COVID, made sure it was a clear mask. And I can tell you the plea was really hard because, what did you call it, allocution?
The allocution.
When they read all of our cases, wow, because I knew these people as my friends. And we didn't necessarily talk about everything that he did because we didn't need to. We understood. We'd all lived through it. But hearing each one of their stories, I think was one of the most sad events I've ever sat through, because there were 30 of our friends. I mean, the victims bonded together. We got together all the time. We'd go to Carol, there you are. We'd go to Carol Daly's house after every hearing so we could download and process. We knew each other. We saw each other outside of the hearings. So that was very impactful, but again, necessary. It was good. It just was a lot.
So before I talk about the last point and ask you the last question about Phyllis's Garden, I do want to tell a story because you brought it up with the clear face shield. So leading up to the plea, I had this nightmare because that he would sit up there and hide behind a mask. And so we had a court proceeding in front of Judge Bowman, and sometimes you have to go on a rant to tell the judge that you care about something. So near the end of that argument, I said, Judge, when Joseph DeAngelo committed his crimes, he wore a mask. His badges and uniform was a mask. His family was a mask. His children was a mask. His life as a retired mechanic was nothing more than a mask. So when he pleads guilty in front of all these people, he shouldn't be wearing a mask anymore. He should be wearing this. So, because I'd gone on Amazon and bought a clear face shield, right? And Judge Bowman, who was here a little while ago, he knew I had set it up a certain way, and he kind of looked and he says, I think that sounds reasonable. What do you think, Mr. Kress, who is the public defender? And so he had to wear this clear face shield. And so we get to the Sac State Bar Room, and I talk about in the case here. Now, usually when you walk into a courtroom, you always see from the audience perspective, the back or the side of the defendant's head, right? So I was taught many years ago to get to the courtroom before everybody else. So we got to the Sac State Ballroom, and it's like a stage like this. So I get up there, and the staff, the staff had set the table like it is in a courtroom. And what the heck is this? So I moved the table around, and I made it so that the defense table where the defendant would sit is facing the audience. And then I called over to Captain, or at that point it was Sergeant Dinelli. He was head of the SWAT team and handling security. I said, Dinelli, and he says, what? We're doing this for security. And he looked at me and said, what? We're doing this for security. And he said, what? I said, we're doing this for effing security. He says, okay. So my friends from the public defender's office don't know this, but later they get to the courtroom, and Joe Kress, first thing he looks at the table, and he's like just walking up and down. He's wondering, why is the table set this way, right? I could see it, like the wheels turning in his head. And then he says, and he's whispering to the other public defender, Alice Michael, and I hear them talking. I said, oh shoot, I think they caught on. And so all of a sudden, Joe Kress says, Judge, why is the table set this way? And so Judge Bowman from the corner, he looks over because he's looking at his bench where he's sitting, and he looks over and he said, yeah, why is the table set this way? And just on cue, Sergeant Dinelli said, Judge, it's for security. And that's how the table got set that way. And in the book, I talk about how Jane Carson confronted DeAngelo that day, and it was such a beautiful story. But I want to transition to the last point before we sign books, because I know a lot of people came here to do that. I want you to take a moment and talk about the inspiration behind Phyllis's Garden and why it's so important to you, and why I am a huge supporter, and everybody in this room needs to be a huge supporter of Phyllis's Garden. Can you share with us that?
I would love to share that with you. So this goes back to us making friends, victims, bonding. And one victim in particular, Phyllis, she and I bonded right from the beginning. We made fudge together. We went to lunch. We honestly would talk for 2 hours on the phone at a time. And my husband would walk by, I'm on the phone, and he'd go, Phyllis? I'm like, yeah. And, because that's who it would be. And during her, going through the process, was hard for her. And she was the first one. She didn't have support. Her mother had passed away. And I don't know, we were there for each other. And we would drive together to the hearings. You know, we were kind of a pair. And when she got sick, it was heartbreaking. And we were all so happy that she was able to see justice be served. I mean, that was a big, big deal. But having the honor of being by her bedside as she was passing away, it just cemented more of that bond, that friendship. Carol Daly there praying with her every day, and us trying to let Karen, her sister, have some breaks. It's something that I will never forget, and it was a gift that I was really lucky that I was able to give. So that's Phyllis, and then Phyllis passes away, as Thien was saying. But I had made another really good friend, Gay Hardwick, and I'd love, Gay, for you to just stand up right now. Gay and we made fast friends as well. We met during the filming of I'll Be Gone in the Dark, and and we talked about a lot of pain. But eventually, we started to say, we don't want to talk about pain. Let's create something beautiful. Let's create something good. Let's create something that says resilience. And we were up at her cabin, and we were bouncing names back and forth, and I had some kind of dumb names, and she's like, no. And then she said, how about Phyllis's Garden? I was like, bingo, that's perfect. And we created Phyllis's Garden, and that is just to honor her, but for all all victims of sexual assault, for what we go through, for the strength that's being built, for the, I call it metamorphosis in motion that happens during your journey for survival. And so Gay and I got to work and created this nonprofit, and now we have 4 different programs. We make soft interview rooms for police departments, and there are requirements for that. They have to have a trauma-informed detective on board. And, you know, when you have a victim of something that just happened that is the worst thing that could happen, go into an interrogation room to be interviewed, even if it's with a trauma-informed officer, it sends the wrong message. It's sterile, it's cold, it's metal, there's handcuffs hanging from the bar on the side, and guess what they want? They want to get out of there. But that's not what the detective needs. The detective needs information so they can catch the bad guy. And so we thought we need to create a room that is respectful, compassionate, and comforting when victims who are brave enough to report come in to report their, or to go through and give their statement. And so we've done that through most of our stations in Sacramento. The rooms are painted really soft color. There are swivel chairs, so when they have that extra energy, you know, going through terrible details they don't want to tell. There are refreshments because we don't know the last time they ate. And there's blankets that they can take home. There's every kind of comfort. There's fidget toys. Anything that we could think of, we'd brainstorm what else needs to go in there. And so we pretty much we still have a few in Sacramento County, but we're also reaching out. We're doing Riverside, Fresno, San Joaquin County. My goal is that no victim, no matter where they live, goes into an interrogation room to be interviewed. And that means every station has to have one. I have a couple more programs too. I'll go in real. We have a support group that's online. It's called Sexual Assault Survivors. It's Time to Tell Your Story. There's about 1,200 people on there. We have an in-person support group that's called UBU, and that is 6 months out of the year in a garden that represents Phyllis. And we get to be who we are. You don't need a mask. If you want to cry, you can cry. Most of us are pretty good friends now, and we look forward to seeing each other. We have people like DA Ho comes in. We have Maylin and Anne come in. We have people come in within the community that talk about resources that nobody knows exists. And then lastly, we have another program where we go out and we talk kind of like this to law enforcement. I do detective training and cadet training, because you can read all about rape in a book, but until you hear it from somebody that's gone through it, you don't know what it's like. And we want to make sure that those officers, when they see a victim for the first time, that they understand how important what they say and what they do is. And then we also do conferences to anything to get the word out so that rape survivors know they're not alone, and that other people know what they go through, and it is their responsibility to help support rape survivors, because maybe if we did, more people would report.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And to Jennifer and Todd, I want to apologize for both of you. It's my old trial lawyer instinct and just taking over a conversation and jumping in like I couldn't help. It's been a while since I've been in the courtroom. So my apologies, and I got to tell you, these two are great. I mean, they both read the book. The questions that they ask, I mean, you can tell when somebody's read a book and they know what they're doing. But I want to thank you guys for being such amazing hosts, the library for doing so. But if there was any other questions, I do see a lot of people here, so I know I'm probably going to have to file a workers' comp claim later for all the signings I have to do, but I do want to be able to sign everybody's book.
I think we should move into the book signing portion of things. Book signing is going to happen outside of the library where you came in. I do really sincerely want to thank you for coming and sharing the story here in Sacramento. When I heard about this, it was important to me that we do it here. So I really want to thank you, District Attorney Ho, and Chris, I really want to thank you for coming and spending time with us.